sound of it now. Hey, I got some parts in for that clutch, new actuator. Let's tear that clutch apart and see why it's sticking. Welcome to Urban Monk TV. So you might recall in the last video that I got it running and tuned up and then threw it in gear thinking I'm going for a ride. And I didn't go anywhere because the clutch is still engaged. It won't disengage. And the other problem I'm having, which didn't get touched on in the video, is the amount of pressure, sorry about the squeaking, that I have to exert on the clutch lever and through the cable and through that whole mechanism is a lot. And so if you go way back in my videos to when I was assembling the clutch parts, I had lubricated a part like this. It's called an actuator, and it's essentially just a screw that turns, you know, a pulling motion into a lateral motion, and thus, you know, pushes that way. So as I pull on the cable, I'm pushing a pin through the engine, and you know, it's a push rod, and that opens up the clutch basket. So we got a twofold problem. This, I lubricated this part, which it's full of lubrication and grease, but perhaps it's just really badly worn. So I got a new one. This one's tarnished, but it's new as far as manufacture. It's just an old part, but it's never been installed. So I'm going to put that in and see where that gets us. And then I've got to unstick the plates on the other side. Here is where that actuator is on the engine. And so I'm going to have to take this cover off, which means I've got to disconnect my gear shift linkage. And then we'll pull that off and disconnect the cable on the other side and get that actuator changed out. Hopefully there's less resistance with the new one. Have to remove the bolt completely because it's slotted on the shaft. There is the push rod that goes through the crank into the clutch on the other side. I think I will open the other side here before I go and switch this out, because there is like no resistance on this actuator at all. This oil really has, you know, nothing for time on it, really. Minutes. And but I'm gonna have to drain it, and my oil drain pan is not something that I keep clean enough to reuse the oil, so this will be lost oil.
You don't know what love is until you fall in love one time. You don't know what love is until you fall in love one time. She dangled my life on a string. You know she almost blew my mind. From sun up to sundown, she kept my nose right down to the ground.
It's a good example of the kind of engineering that engineers used to do for the owner or the maintainer of a motorcycle. I don't know that quite this much thought is given to this kind of thing today. You know, I guess asking someone who either is an engineer at a motorcycle manufacturing company or someone who works in service on modern day bikes, but they put this little tab of metal into the casting for this part so that you could stick a screwdriver out under here and pry against, it's a pry point, just to get this thing broken loose. That's the guys in manufacturing thinking about the guy who has to go back in after this thing is sold and fix it for the customer or for the customer themselves. I love that kind of stuff. The other thing too is this big fat, what do you want to call that, gusset, has a dowel in it, so if you're prying here you're torsioning this, and so you want to kind of get that loose and then work up here, and it should slide right off. I feel something tearing somewhere. Might need a new gasket. Yeah, I tore it down at the bottom. So the first thing that's jumping out to me here as I try to investigate my problem, and let's revisit what my problem is. The problem is twofold. One, this clutch won't disengage, and two, the amount of resistance or pressure on the whole mechanism, thus sending, you know, all of that resistance up the cable to the lever where I've got to have the incredible Hulk grip to even pull the thing in. Those are the two problems. And the first thing I'm noticing, 7, 7, 7, 7, 4, and 4. And I notice this H7. I'm going to go to the parts diagram and see what I can learn about what bolts are supposed to be here. I'm thinking that somebody prior to me, because I guarantee I kept all of the bolts that were originally on this bike, you know, in the Ziploc bag I had all of this in, and I'm wondering if these two are not supposed to be here, if they're too short, or maybe all of these are too short. This has a 7 and so does this, but it's got a completely different head on it, and I'm just wondering if these bolts are too short and thus these springs are compressed, they're like pre-compressed too much. So we have a push rod that goes through the entire bike from the other side. I mean, really, all the travel should be right about there. And it's smooth in that spot. I don't see that as the issue. Okay, so what I did was take a small screwdriver in between a couple of these, the first discs here, and just gave it a little twist. And it came loose, but it was stuck there. Each of these has just got the tiniest amount of resistance to it. So I think what I may do, I mean, they've got oil all over them, which is a good thing. I may take these out, remeasure the thickness of each of these plates, and then also measure any sort of warp or deviation from flatness. The other thing I want to do is look at these bolts. What is different about them? Here is a 7. Here is a 4. That should just indicate the tensile strength of the actual metal to make the bolt. At first glance, these look exactly the same in length. 15 millimeters from the washer. Yeah, I mean, there's no difference there in length, and you know, clearly they're the same in diameter. So that, I don't see the fact that we've got a number 4 bolt and a number 7 bolt, you know, intermixed as being the issue that's causing my clutch to stick. The other piece is the resistance to the pull in my hand. Well, of course, that's these in part, and then it might be any sort of sticking with that push rod, but these are supposed to be, when they're free like this, no less than 35.9 millimeters. I'm at 37.4. 37. 37. These appear to be the same springs. I just want to see if the diameter of the spring itself, 2.37. These are all the same. Yeah. These are the springs that belong in there. Well, I shouldn't say that. They are the springs that were in there, and they are clearly a set with each other, and they're within spec that I can tell. They're all fine. It's not the springs or the bolts. Another thing I wanted to check here was just resistance free of the clutch mechanism on the cable and the lever itself, and with the actuator removed from the engine, essentially. Here, let me show you what I'm talking about. With this cover pulled from the engine, but the cable and everything connected with its spring in there. Hope you can see that. I just wanted to see, is there an excessive amount of resistance on this system before I look at other areas? I gotta tighten that bolt up. I don't even have a nut on that. Good catch. Anyways, not an excessive amount of resistance. You see how that moves outward a little bit and thus would push just a little bit on that rod. It's pretty easy. Really not much to it, other than I've got to find that nut. Got a nut up under here. I'm just trying to tighten it. Can't see what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, so looking further at the matter, you know, these springs appear to be OEM. I cannot find anything that would indicate that these are heavy duty in any way. I looked up OEM springs and they have the same yellow markings on them, you know, images that I find online. And then as far as these bolts go, while two of them are of a different rating in tensile strength, they're the right thread, they're the right length. That tensile strength thing isn't going to be the reason I'm having a sticking clutch problem. So what I'm going to do is pull out the clutch plates and lubricate them with fresh oil, you know, making sure that they're all separate from each other and not just stuck. I'm going to reassemble the clutch with 3 of these springs just to see if that changes the amount of resistance that I'm feeling. If suddenly the resistance problem just isn't there anymore, then maybe I'm looking at heavy duty springs here, but I doubt it. Then I'm going to put all the springs back on, all 6, and I'm going to change that actuator to the new one. Let's take a look at that actuator. Here is the new one, and all this thing is a simple screw and a nylon sleeve. And I have to admit, this is pretty easy to turn. This is lubricated and clean. Now let's look at the one on the bike. I gotta say this one has a bit more resistance to it, but in fact, you know, there is a spot where it really catches. Oh, well, that's the spring being caught. All right, so I can't say that this is any different feeling whatsoever than the new one. It's a little dirtier, but it's also got some green grease that I put in there, which was not a bad idea in any way. So maybe that's my issue. I'm gonna go ahead and you know, the spring here is a lot more resistance than this mechanism, and of course you need the spring to pull the cable back, pull your lever back into its regular position. So this really shouldn't be it. I'm going to clean it up, but I don't see this as the issue. It works well, and the nylon sleeve is not worn. It's just 2 screws to get it off of there. I'll take it out and clean it. Again, old one off the bike now. Hard to say that I'm feeling any difference there. Perhaps this is slightly easier. And so under a heavy load, which, you know, all 6 of these springs, yeah, maybe that's the issue. Okay, so new one installed on the bike. You know, clutch action is good here.
Let's button this up on this side. Okay, so now that I've got the cover back on this side, I have brought the cable all the way down in to make, you know, the mechanism return to out as much as possible. As it rotates up, it drives the pin that way into the clutch on the other side. As it rotates clockwise from this perspective, it comes back out at us. And so over on the other side, I don't have my, you know, these are the bearings that run against the pressure plate. I don't have that all the way in. I don't know that I need it all the way in, but I'm guessing I need less gap than that, so I want it to go further that way. So I back this screw out. And having done that, now this goes further in. I'm going to keep going out with the screw until this is flush. Well, that's as far in as it'll go. In fact, that's as far as it needs to go. Actually, I could put this in a little bit further. I can't even see while I'm holding the camera. Anywho, let me get the clutch plates out of there, separated, oiled, and then we'll reinstall it. Oil should, I mean, this just goes without saying with any motorcycle of vintage like this, should not have the friction modifiers or have the high efficiency marking on it. I can show you later in the video what I mean by that. I didn't really pour enough on here. Let me get some more oil. What I mean is in this, can you see that? Yeah, in this little circle here, you do not want on the bottom half of it to say high efficiency or anything about for economy or something like that. It means it has friction additives to it, and you do not want that. Also, this oil that I use is intended for diesel engines and has a high amount of zinc in it, which is good for these old motorcycles. Plus it's Jasso, where are we at here? Jasso MA and MA2 certified, so that's good for old vintage motorcycles with wet clutches like this. Okay, got them all in there. Again, need this piece in there with the bearings facing out. That runs against this washer in here. And that pressure plate just rides up against there. I'm going to put 3 of those bolts in a triangle pattern, and I want to feel the resistance on it with just that. So the hypothetical here is, what if these bolts are too short and thus they're driving the springs in too far and there's too much resistance on this pressure plate because of that? My logic is flawed in that even if the bolt was longer, it's all about taking that washer at the top of that spring and compressing it down to, you know, this inner basket. I don't know what you call that piece, but it's part of the basket itself that holds all of the clutch plates. And, you know, long bolt or short bolt, it doesn't matter. You do torque it all the way down flat to that. So that's not it.
The reason I'm not so satisfied, the reason that I'm blue, I still don't have you.
It's not very tight. Okay.
Let me feel this thing. I want to see if I need some adjustment on the other side. I might.
Yeah, I'm not even making contact here. So I'm going to go ahead and screw this in until I feel it make contact. And I may have to bring this nut out. We'll see. And what we're doing is pressing that rod into our clutch plates. Need to hold the retaining nut from spinning with it. Okay, so there I've made contact. I'm just going to back it off a little bit, and then I can tighten this up. Okay, now that's not a lot of resistance. That's all it really should take. You know, when you're feathering your clutch, what you're doing is I'm letting out, and it's just slowly bringing those two together. And when they're tight, it bonds and the drive, so the outer basket is driving. Now, when I'm like this, the inner basket is loose and can spin freely with the rear wheel. And then as I let it in, then, you know, the engine crankshaft and this intermediary shaft that goes to the, you know, drive chain and sends torque to the rear wheel become one. So this is just a disconnect mechanism. I don't know. To me, this feels like a reasonable amount of resistance. I'm going to put those other 3 springs in and see what it feels like. Okay, now all 6 are in and torqued. Let me feel. It's pretty tight, but they're loosening up. Okay, bike's in neutral, and as I roll it back and forth, you know, no change with the clutch, obviously. Let me put it into first gear. Clutch is still pulled out, and I am still rigid as can be here. No movement. Even with the clutch loose. Now I'm in second or third, I'm not sure. There we go. You see movement now. You're only going to see the spinning on the outside of this basket. What you can't see is you know, the inner shaft that goes to the front sprocket and drive chain. But we do seem to be loose again here, which is good. And now the ferrule end of my clutch cable has broken off, so I've removed the cable from the bike.
The amount of resistance on this system is significant, and I don't know if I've got heavy-duty springs. I don't know, what the issue is here exactly, or it's just simply my repair or my shortening of this cable. It just simply isn't up to the task. And so stay tuned for a future video on how I deal with this, but I cannot ride safely with a clutch cable that I don't trust. Having the clutch fail on you while you're riding isn't exactly a fun situation. Actually had that happen to me once.
So I'm perplexed. I honestly don't know where to go from here. I feel like when I roll that back and forth that I'm still turning the engine, and I feel compression. I'll just throw it out to you guys. What do you think? Do I button that clutch back up, fill it with oil, fire the thing up, pull in that clutch, put it in gear, and see if it stays loose with the clutch lever pulled in, or if it kills on me again? I'm just not feeling, rolling around here on the floor or even on the lift, that it's really disengaging when that pressure plate comes out. But in all theory, it should be disengaged, and perhaps this is just stiction, friction between these plates. And the other thing I will add is I'm not using 10W40 oil, I'm using 15W40, so just slightly thicker while cold. Hard to believe that's going to be the deal breaker here, that 5 points in viscosity on the cold end. So I don't know. What do you think? Should I button it up or tear it apart again? Or is there some other advice out there? The other thing I will add is I've gone on to the GS Resources, which is a huge forum on these bikes, and have searched clutch and clutch problems and sticking clutch and you name it. I've put a search in there, and I've come up with 1 or 2 guys talking about just breaking it loose, like rolling it down a hill with the engine not running and popping it into gear. Perhaps I could try that before I fire the engine up, after I button it all up together again. I don't know. What do you guys think? Hey, if you like what I'm doing in this video series or on my V-Strom videos, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching.